Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Welcome to the July 2018 Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on IT Management Fundamentals. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I am the President and CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this series, and I'm also going to be the presenter for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company. Our team of nearly 40 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're technology experts, and we have been consistently named a top 200 North American managed service provider by MSP Mentor, an honor that we received again last year in 2017. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to get right into it. And I'm really looking forward to reviewing IT management fundamentals with you all. Because of the pace of innovation in technology, and because of sort of the shiny new technology syndrome that's often occurring in IT, there's a tendency to focus on the technology itself and forget about the importance of managing that technology effectively. I believe that most people, though, would agree with me when I say that without proper IT management, IT cannot be successful. And we're all too familiar. I think everyone on this webinar, I would guess, is familiar with all of the things that happen when you don't have effective IT management. I'd like to run through a couple of those and just see if any of these sound familiar to you, and you can use the chat feature to send me any of your own sort of thoughts on the sorts of things that happen when IT isn't managed properly. So, unsolved problems. Staff have IT problems that never seem to get solved. I believe that can be traced back to a lack of proper IT management. Unused solutions. IT solutions that have been purchased but may not have ever been deployed, or they've been deployed but they're not being used by the staff. If that happens, it's generally the result of a lack of IT management. Frustrated staff. In an organization where the staff are constantly frustrated and unhappy with their IT, in general, the main culprit is a lack of IT management. Failed projects. Often people will pursue IT projects that end up not being successful. Either they don't achieve the objectives that they were set out to achieve, they never get completed. That can happen with IT projects. They run well over budget. They do not achieve the original scope of the project. Those are all things that happen when you don't have proper IT management. Information goes missing, either through the attack of a crypto virus that renders all of your files inaccessible, or through a hacking event, hardware fails and you don't have the ability to restore the information that is lost. There are a variety of different ways in which that can happen. But again, if your information is missing, you're losing a valuable asset, and it can be traced back to a lack of proper IT management. And then costly mistakes. And things can happen that end up costing the organization a lot more than they would have if they had invested in IT properly in the first place. So there's probably other examples you can think of, and again, I encourage you to chat those in if you have any in mind. But it turns out that most of the failures that we encounter with IT are, in my view, the result of ineffective management. Now, there are bad technology solutions, it's true, and there are inappropriate technology solutions. But in general, it's more common for there to be, inappropriate solutions that are poorly implemented and improperly supported. And it kind of requires all of those elements for things to fail. And that, again, can be traced back to poor or lack of IT management. And yet, despite the central importance of IT management, it doesn't always receive the proper attention. In fact, as I was preparing for this webinar today, I went back and looked over our library of webinars. We've been doing webinars since 2012, so we have 60 plus cataloged on our website. And I actually had to go back 2 years to July. It was exactly 2 years ago, July of 2016, that we last had a webinar that really focused on an IT management topic, and that was building an effective nonprofit IT department. So even though I'm a firm believer in the importance of IT management, we haven't done a webinar on this topic in 2 years. And so, it's kind of the vegetables of IT in some ways, especially when compared with shiny new technology. So it's not always popular, but it is essential. So I just want to offer my kudos to all of you who are joining us today. So I think there's a clear business case for focusing on IT management. Without it, IT solutions won't function properly, they'll fail to deliver business value, and ultimately, they'll fail to deliver or provide a return on investment. And IT solutions can be expensive. They could end up being a significant portion of an organization's budget. And so it's really important that they be implemented in a way that really delivers a return on investment. So how do we think about IT management? And actually, there are a wide range of frameworks for thinking about IT management, such as, and they all involve an alphabet soup of different approaches. There's COBIT, which is controls for business IT, Microsoft Operations Framework, which has been around for a long time. People have even tried to apply manufacturing methodologies such as Six Sigma or Lean to IT management. By far the most popular is a framework called ITIL or ITIL, and that's something that we practice here at Community IT, and it can be very effective. But all of these are, essentially a set of methodologies that you can follow. Before we get into that, what I'd really like to talk about, though, is sort of the concept of what makes an organization, or sort of defines the organization's capacity to manage IT effectively. And the model that I keep returning to and that I've found really useful is Gartner's infrastructure and operations maturity model. Now, maturity models, well, many of you are probably familiar with maturity models. They're fairly common, particularly in IT. But maturity models define the maturity level of an organization. And in this case, this particular maturity model defines how well that organization is delivering IT services to the rest of the business. It's essentially telling you it's rating the maturity of the IT department as it relates to the rest of the business. So as with most maturity models, 0 is the worst and 5 is the best. 0 is survival. So if you're at a 0 maturity level, you're just barely surviving. You're constantly putting out fires, and there's no proactive approach to implementing or managing IT solutions, and there's no alignment between IT and the rest of the organization. Maturity level 1 is awareness, where there's some understanding that there's a problem, but there's really no committed effort to solving that problem. Level 2, maturity level 2, is that there's committed steps being taken. The organization is committed to improving its IT maturity, but it hasn't yet put into place standard processes or practices. It may not have yet implemented an organizational structure that can effectively deliver IT services. 3 is the proactive level. That's the point at which a proactive approach to IT is finally being taken. So that can include things like an annual IT plan, IT budget, proactive maintenance of technology solutions, all fall into the proactive maturity level. The next level up, service aligned, is where the services that are being delivered are aligned with the business needs of the organization. And so the organization's business, in the case of nonprofits, the mission requirements that the organization has, those are being effectively communicated to the IT department, and the IT department is keeping those in mind and trying to meet those business needs in the solutions and services that it's delivering. And then finally, the top business level, or maturity level is business partnership, and that's where IT is seen as an equal stakeholder with the rest of the organization. And so the strategic planning of the organization involves IT at an integral level. The senior leadership of IT is considered to be also the senior leadership of the organization as a whole, and IT is an integral value add for the work that the organization is doing. One of the things that's important to note about the maturity model is that it is a process, and you don't just go straight from survival to business partnership. And I think a lot of organizations that want their IT to be more effective may be down at level 1 and they want to be at level 5, and they're frustrated that they're not at level 5. And I think it's important to remember that it requires a process to go from level 1 to level 5. You really have to implement good management. You have to implement standardized processes. And so I've actually found it useful to map this maturity model with 2 axes. And those would be the management capability of IT and the business alignment of IT. So if you have very low business alignment and very low management capability, you're going to be down at maturity level 0 or 1. And as you move up in the maturity levels, your management capability is increasing dramatically, and the business alignment of IT with the business needs of the organization is also increasing dramatically. So those 2 factors can help us define the various organizational approaches to IT that you often find in the nonprofit sector. And we can take those 2 factors and, sort of look at them in a slightly different way in this quadrant. So you've got on one axis, business aligned, non-aligned, on the other axis, unmanaged and managed. And so organizations that have low management capability, they're down in that lower left-hand axis, and are not aligned with the business needs, are essentially in a dysfunctional situation. So if you're in a situation where IT is just dysfunctional, chances are it's not being managed properly, and the services that are being delivered by the IT function, whether it's a department or just an individual or an outsourced provider, those services are not aligned with the business needs of the organization. And that's a dangerous place to be because it just leads to a lot of frustration, and frankly, it leads to a lot of wasted resources. Now you can start to manage your IT a little bit more effectively and still not be completely aligned with the business. And in that scenario, IT is seen as a cost center. So those are organizations that have management capacity that are starting to manage their IT more effectively, but they've not necessarily aligned IT solutions or services with the business needs of the organization. And in those situations, it's natural they're going to view IT as a cost center. It's a necessary evil that demands some level of expense because, frankly, let's be honest, in this day and age, you have to have a computer to work, to survive. You have to be able to send and receive email, to create documents, and so forth. So it's a necessary evil that demands some expense, but it's not really seen as an investment that's expected to provide some kind of return for the organization. The best situation occurs when IT solutions are both aligned with business needs and are also well managed. And it's important to note that in that scenario, IT is seen as creating value for the rest of the organization. And that's a really mutually beneficial situation, both for the organization and for the IT department, the group or the person that's responsible for IT. They're seen as creating value for the rest of the organization, which for us IT folks is just a wonderful situation to be in. It's important to note that as you move to the upper third quadrant, this creating value quadrant, the value of the investment also grows. So dysfunctional organizations may spend less on IT. Their total IT spend may be less than business aligned and well-managed organizations, but they also have the lowest level of return on their investment because they're not getting any value from their IT. And this concept can be particularly challenging for nonprofit organizations because nonprofits tend to have pretty strict limits on their ability to generate revenue. And so they're sort of by their nature in a cost control situation. And the return on investment tends to be measured more in the form of social benefit or mission terms rather than in financial terms. And so it sometimes can be hard to create a business case for IT investment because oftentimes creating value doesn't take the form of a financial investment. So the cost benefit analysis can be a little bit more challenging. But still, a case can be made, and organizations with higher levels of IT maturity tend to be more effective in accomplishing their goals and achieving their mission, which is really the primary objective of both the board, the nonprofit board, as well as the senior leadership of the nonprofit. So the IT department or the IT function really needs to make a case that investing properly in IT will help the organization achieve its mission goals more effectively. And that's how value is really being created in the nonprofit context. And if that case can be made, then it's possible to recruit the governance of the organization into a position of fostering improved IT maturity. And in fact, in my experience at least, the only entity that can really move an organization from the lower left-hand quadrant to the upper right-hand quadrant is governance. Without governance, an organization, might be able to find a good manager, but the most she or he can hope for is to be seen as, an effective cost center for the organization. The business alignment part really requires involved governance and oversight of IT. So I want to take a few minutes just to talk about that word because that can be kind of a scary word, and people sort of their eyes can glaze over, or it can, you immediately think of a 30-page document of bylaws, and that's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about governance as a relationship between IT and the rest of the organization. So the basic purpose and role of governance is to hold IT accountable for creating business value for the rest of the organization. And so when governance is not present, if governance is absent, some of the things you might hear are, well, there's no buy-in. I'm not getting any buy-in for IT at this organization. There's no executive support. Those are kind of colloquial expressions that reflect an absence of effective IT governance. So the role of governance is to hold IT accountable for creating business value for the rest of the organization. So I want you to just think about that for a second. Is that the case at your organization? Is there someone outside of IT who holds a senior level in the organization that's holding IT accountable for creating business value for the rest of the organization? Because if that's not happening, then it's very unlikely that the organization can move up to the quadrant of creating value. So who's supposed to do this? You might be asking. Generally, for smaller organizations, it's provided by a director of operations or finance. For larger organizations, it might be a CIO, CFO. Sometimes it could be provided by a technology committee. In my experience, technology committees can be somewhat unfocused because they're not the primary responsibility of anyone on the technology committee. And in fact, if you look at sort of, well, how did this technology committee get created in the first place? Oftentimes it was the result of some political issue that was affecting the organization in the past. And rather than establish, a clear line of ownership over IT, a technology committee was created instead. So they can be effective, but I think it's important to note that you wouldn't have a finance committee for managing your finances, right? Most organizations have a single senior leader who's responsible for the finances, whether the CFO, COO, director of operations, or finance. In the same way, you wouldn't then, delegate that responsibility to a committee of people from various departments. So I think that's a good, anytime you're establishing a governance structure or an accountability structure around technology, I always like to ask myself, well, would I do the same thing with finance, with financial oversight? Because in many ways, IT is responsible for the information assets of the organization. I didn't include the board on here. I probably should have, uh, because obviously the nonprofit board is fundamentally the key governing body of the organization. And there are times where the board does provide IT governance. And this actually is becoming more common, especially as more and more board members have experience with or background in technology, and that it can be very effective. The board obviously has a lot of authority to move the organization in certain directions, and so boards that take an interest in IT can be very effective in helping the organization improve its IT maturity. Um, it can be misguided at times if you have, a single board member who's got sort of a pet project that they want to see implemented, and that person is not really, in the absence of IT governance, a lone board member who's a bit of an activist for a pet project can create problems. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. So I'm guessing that most of the attendees on this webinar um, are either on the governance or management side of IT for their organization. Some of you may be in a role that's sort of ancillary to IT. Some of you may be providing direct technical work, but based on the registrations that I looked over before starting, it seemed to me that most of the attendees are either on the governance side or the management side. And so the question becomes, how do you effectively hold IT accountable? Most nonprofit staff that are charged with providing IT governance don't necessarily have a technical background. And oftentimes when I'm working with those staff at our clients, they'll tell me that they don't know anything about IT. Oftentimes someone who's in the governance role might say, look, I'd love to hold IT accountable, but I don't even know what questions to ask. I don't know anything about technology. And I'll say, and I just want to encourage all of you who are in that situation, that while it helps to have a technical background, it's not necessary. And in fact, the IT management fundamentals that we'll be discussing in the remainder of this webinar can be, I think, readily understood by anyone in any management position throughout the organization. And I've worked with hundreds of nonprofit staff over the years at hundreds of organizations. And in thinking back on the people that I've worked with, those who've played the governance role the best and really helped to turn the organization into one that was creating value through technology did not have a technical background. But what they had was the ability to ask lots of questions. And they would ask follow-up questions, and they would generally say, look, I don't know anything about IT. And then they would ask a fantastic question, not in technical terms, but in business terms. And they would really, they would require that we explain, our technology recommendations in business terms. Those were really the most effective. So if you're on the governance side, I would encourage you to just keep asking questions of IT. Ask them to explain. And fundamentally, anyone who is in an IT management role has to be able to explain and draw a connection between the technology solution and the business need that it could solve. They don't necessarily have to understand all of the business needs of the organization or necessarily be able to make all of those business decisions, but they have to be able to connect the dots between technology solutions and business needs. I think that's a fundamental, just a basic requirement of being in an IT management position. So asking questions is definitely the best way to hold IT accountable. In small organizations, that could just be, a weekly or a monthly check-in. Obviously, it takes on a more formal structure. The nature of it becomes more formal in larger organizations. Larger organizations that have defined structures for governance can apply those structures to IT. Excuse me. So what questions do you need to ask? Now we really get to the meat of this presentation, and I'd really like to talk about these 4 functional domains. And these, I really like to think of effective IT management as fulfilling 4 different categories of functions: planning and design, information security, operational support, and infrastructure maintenance. And effective IT management has the capacity to execute effectively and deliver IT solutions effectively in each of these 4 functional domains. And this concept of these 4 domains can be applied both to individual IT solutions, so thinking about Office 365, and I'll go into some more specifics later on if we have time. But Office 365 is a pretty common solution for a lot of nonprofits right now. To deliver that solution or that service effectively requires proper planning and design. It requires maintaining proper information security considerations. You have to be able to support the solution over time, and you have to maintain the infrastructure of that solution. And again, I'll get into specifics. But this concept of these 4 functional domains can also be applied to not just a single particular solution, but the entire set of solutions that an organization might be using, and also how all of those solutions fit together. So let's go into some details here. So we'll start with planning and design. So planning and design, each of these 4 functional areas consists of a set of expertises, capabilities that all sort of fit together. And so the chances of getting one person who's really good at planning and design, infrastructure maintenance, operational support and information security is very unlikely. Which is why for larger organizations, you build out an IT department and staff that department with people who bring these different expertises and can work together to ensure that all these things are being delivered for the organization. In smaller organizations, you probably would outsource some of it. You might be able to, for example, planning and design. You might not need someone to help with planning and design on an ongoing basis, but maybe every few years when you're envisioning large changes for the organization, you could bring someone in who has that capability. At any rate, planning and design involves skills such as being able to envision the future. It involves a function of seeing the big picture, understanding the larger context, being able to connect possible technology solutions with organizational business needs, understanding the politics of the organization. These are all things that the IT department has to be able to do in the planning and design domain if they're going to be successful in managing IT. So architecture involves looking at the big picture of the IT services, the systems and solutions used by the organization and how they all fit together. And it's really about achieving and maintaining sort of balance and harmony between the solutions. So if you're looking, organizations that may have a association management system that they've been using for a long time, you have to keep in mind the importance of that system and the limitations of potentially of that system integrating with various email solutions as part of the planning and design process. So if the organization, let's say, has an Access database that they're still using, that could create some challenges with integrating, with the G Suite, for example, if they wanted to go. It's a bit of a far-fetched example, but I think you get the point. So architecture is about seeing the big picture and understanding the big picture. That's an important ability for any effective IT management. And then integration is understanding how and whether or not they should, all those services, how they can and or should be connected to each other. And that has become an even more important task in the last 5 or 6 years as more and more services have moved out to the cloud environment. A vital part of planning and design is change management. And this is where I think a lot of IT management falls short. Um, I think it's possible to do the architecture and the integration fairly well because those tend to be, technical and somewhat insulated. If you're just looking at the technology, you'll have a good sense of, whether or not all of your different systems are going to work together. You can make good decisions about, whether or not you're going to have a firewall that's, more cloud friendly, whether you're going to deploy a wireless solution that meets the needs of opening 5 new locations, over the next 3 or 4 years. But change management is all about the people in the organization that are using the technology. And that has to be taken into account when you're when you're putting together an IT plan. How does the organization normally handle change? Is the organization one that's changing rapidly and sort of has all of that, organizational muscle memory for how to change systems and how to, work in new and different ways? Or is it an organization that hasn't changed in a long time and is very resistant to change? That's incredibly important to keep in mind when you're planning out new IT systems. And that really helps you with prioritizing the systems that you put in place. If you know that it's an organization that can really only handle one change at a time, then you have to prioritize, is it more important for us to upgrade our email system, or is it more important for us to migrate to a new constituent management system? That making those sorts of decisions has to happen in the planning process. And if you're not giving some forethought to those decisions, then the implementation is not going to be successful because it's going to push the organization beyond its abilities. And that's another thing. What are the change limits? If an organization is growing and they're opening new offices, can they also, that typically requires a lot of work on the part of existing staff. Can they also handle the rollout of a new IT system while that's going on? So you can't just look at other IT projects that are occurring. You also have to look at other organizational initiatives that are occurring. Is this the year of a big gala, of an anniversary event? If that's the case, maybe this is an off year for replacing a bunch of workstations. You should wait till next year. Or do you know that in 2020 we have our big 2020 event, so let's get all those workstations replaced in 2019 so that we're setting ourselves up for success in 2020. Those are the sorts of considerations that an organization needs to take into account when it's doing its IT planning. And if you don't execute effectively during the planning phase, you are going to run into problems down the road. And it has nothing to do with how well or how poorly it's not about how good the laptops are or even how well they were deployed. It's about the timing of when you choose to deploy them. And that is vital. Those decisions are really important. And that all happens during the planning and design phase. That's all part of the planning and design capacity or capability of your IT function. User adoption is somewhat related to change management. Change is really about the capacity of the organization to incorporate something new. User adoption is about the capacity of individual staff at the organization to learn and effectively use new technology. And if they don't have time to learn and use new technology, then obviously it's not going to be success. But there are other factors separate from change management that also influence user adoption, such as the savvy of the users. Some organizations have very savvy staff who use IT very effectively, and you can throw a lot of new solutions at them and they take it all in stride. In fact, some organizations have users that are so savvy that if you're not meeting their IT needs, they're going to go out and find their own solutions. That's actually something we see a lot more of these days. So user adoption, it kind of cuts both ways. Like if you have, I think the typical impression that most people have is that nonprofit staff are not good at using technology, and it's kind of an uphill battle to get them to adopt new technology. And I think the reality is it's a lot more varied. there are definitely plenty of cases where organizations are not changing their technology fast enough to keep up with the needs of their users. So that's an important consideration when putting together an IT plan and when thinking about rolling out IT initiatives. And then leadership support is so important to user adoption. I'm sure you've all encountered situations where the senior leadership or senior leader signs off on a new system and then is the biggest stick in the mud in terms of using that system. And it's people recognize that, like, they know that if the ED is not using the system, then it gives them an out for not using it either. And so setting the example, setting the tone for the rest of the organization is really important. And then finally, budgeting. I mean, I say finally, obviously, it's really vital to have an IT budget, but the IT budget is sort of the financial record of all of the decisions that have been made based on the considerations that we just kind of ran through. So the budget is sort of the financial summary of the work that you've done in putting together an effective architecture, thinking about the integration of your different IT services, taking into account the change management needs of the organization, and planning for effective user adoption. And generally, in my experience, each organization is different. Every organization I've worked with has a different approach to budgeting. And in general, sort of the tool that gets used or the methodology that gets adopted is the organization's methodology. And that's generally defined by the financial, whoever's running the financial department. So we did have a question, how to budget for unforeseen incidents. And that is something, I think there's a couple different ways to look at that. One is, how do you budget for disaster recovery? In my view, the organization should have some non-IT, if the organization wants to be prepared to deal with disasters, there would be some sort of non-IT budgeting approach to that. If the office floods, where do you go set up another office? If if some other disaster strikes, how are you accounting for that? The IT mitigation should be included in that part of the budget. Other than that, I don't know if you're going through the planning process effectively, there shouldn't be a whole lot that's unforeseen or unplanned. What will happen is, the program department is launching a new initiative in fiscal year 2019, and they just didn't tell the IT department, and then that becomes sort of an unseen item. And I don't think it's effective to have a line item for that. I think it'd be more effective to say, well, you never told me that you were planning for this initiative, and we'll need to figure out how we're going to budget for it. But really, this is why we all need to collaborate and work together on the planning process. So planning and design, very important part of effective IT management. Let's talk a little bit about the next one, which is information security. And I'm calling it information security because I think that's easy for people to understand, and that's really what we call it in the industry. But information security really refers to control, a broader set of IT functions and capabilities that are really about process control. IT is all about the processing of information. It's about supplementing business processes and workflows in the organization, automating them through IT services. And anytime you're talking about information, access to information, workflows and processes, there are going to be control points. Any effective work or business process is going to have control points to ensure that the process is being, carried out properly, and that it's also, being done in a secure fashion. So that's really that's kind of a broader definition, of what this management domain or function encompasses. And the first one is identity management. And identity management basically is ensuring that the person accessing the IT service is who they say they are. And identity management is something that for a long time, none of us really had to think about because it was all being handled for us by Microsoft. Microsoft's Active Directory or domain controller, you may have heard of, was a local server that you used anytime you entered your username and password to log into your computer, to get access to files, to get access to your email. But that's all changing because of so identity management and access control are really closely related. Identity management is, verifying who you say you are, and access control is then giving you access to the resources that the organization permits you to have access to. And that's become a lot more complicated or sophisticated with the move to the cloud, because now you have, not everything is on a local server. Things are spread out in the cloud in a variety of different places, and it can be much more difficult. And obviously, you can have separate username and passwords for all of your different solutions, but that's fine. There are other ways to approach it, but if you do that, those still need to be managed. And then when someone leaves the organization, their access needs to be removed. So that's really what identity management and access control refers to. And the number one technology solution right now for helping to manage this effectively is something that's called single sign-on. And there are a number of different single sign-on solutions. Okta, OneLogin, Microsoft has one in Office 365 called Azure AD. So there are a number of different ways that you can implement single sign-on. But single sign-on, really, the goal of single sign-on, it's a technology solution that is helping you to consolidate and centrally manage your identity management and access control. Intrusion detection refers to a wide range of events where someone who does not have authority to access a system gains access to it. So that can be everything from a virus. A virus is a form of intrusion detection. It can be credential theft. So if a hacker or malicious agent compromises the credentials of someone who has access to your network and then accesses the network without their permission, without the permission of the organization, that's a form of intrusion detection. And so those are all things that the IT department needs to be thinking about and mitigating on some level, either implementing technology solutions to prevent it from happening, leading the discussion around risk management. So the other aspect to information security is the risk management aspect. And compliance is kind of a big driver of that. And compliance is something that smaller organizations don't necessarily have to deal with, but it's something that larger organizations, particularly depending on the work that they do, need to be mindful of. And compliance can be, a great way of getting organizations to take information security more seriously. But the IT department needs to be aware, at least, of the compliance requirements that the organization is facing. And there are other things that go along with compliance. Oftentimes there's reporting requirements. So HIPAA, for example, if there's intrusion suspected, that has to be reported to the appropriate, compliance officer at the organization, and then they make a determination as to whether or not that gets reported to the Department of Health and Human Services. So the reporting requirements are something that IT needs to be aware of. Compliance typically is a negative motivator, and most larger businesses that are subject to regulatory compliance requirements, invest in systems because of the penalty. The risk of having to pay a penalty motivates the investing. It's kind of a reverse cost-benefit analysis. Like, you're not getting the value that you're getting is not having to pay the penalty, basically. But there are other, even if you're not subject to compliance regulations, there can be significant brand damage or brand costs associated with unauthorized access to the system. So that's something that organizations need to be aware of, and that needs to be, communicated. So that's a way that IT can be held accountable. So essentially, these are all, business requirements that need to be defined by the organization in concert with the IT function. And then policy finally, and you may wonder why I put policy under information security rather than planning and design, because it sort of seems like, well, policy is a written document that sort of goes along with the document creation involved in planning and design. And in some ways, developing a written policy is sort of like planning or budgeting. But at the same time, if all you have is a policy document, then you just have words on paper, and actually the policy is mostly irrelevant unless it's being enforced. And enforcing the policy really becomes the domain of the information security. Executing effectively on information security is all about enforcing the policies. Because ultimately, policy is a written summary of process controls that define what the staff and the organization can and can't do. And so as a process control, it fits more naturally into information security. All right, so let's move on to the next. Now we're moving into things that operational support is really, when you think about IT or the IT department, most people think about operational support. And the goal of operational support is to maintain the status quo. That's really the whole. So hopefully planning and design has been performed effectively and new solutions are being implemented properly. Once they're implemented, you basically have sort of an operational status quo. So that would mean, essentially your director of finance, let's say, that they can come in the morning, turn on their computer, log into it, access the systems that they have the ability to access, whether it's their email, whether it's the financial accounting package. They can print off reports, they can mail reports, they can upload them, they can check bank balances, they can process payroll payments. That all represents sort of the status quo for those IT services. And anytime there's a deviation from that status quo, the objective or the goal of operational support is to restore service as quickly as possible. And this is really so that's one of three different things that operational support is supposed to do. And that's a concept that comes from ITIL. So one of the great concepts or frameworks or ways of thinking in ITIL is that every trouble ticket that gets submitted to IT is actually one of three things. It's either an incident, and an incident is deviation from status quo. And with an incident, you want to try to restore service as quickly as possible. It's a service request, and so that's something that's basically creating a new sort of standard of service that hasn't existed before. So a service request would be create a new user account for this person who's starting, or give this person just got promoted, give them access to these systems now. And service requests tend to be fulfilled within the context of a service level agreement. So, sometimes depending on the needs of the organization, those will be filled quickly, sometimes not as quickly. And then because to fulfill everything right away is expensive, and the organization has to make some decisions about how much they're willing to invest in their help desk, because rapid response has a cost associated with it. And then finally, problems, which are things which are more complex than incidents, that generally involve a large number of systems or involve some persistent issue that requires more advanced troubleshooting. But basically, you have a help desk that can provide remote support, generally over the phone or via chat, that can restore service to the status quo quickly. You could have desk side or on-site support. For larger organizations, on-site support tends to be more efficient. For smaller organizations, help desk support tends to be more efficient. For organizations that have lots of offices, help desk remote support is more efficient. So there's kind of a balance, and it sort of depends on a variety of factors, including the size of the organization. On-site support can be more effective if there are a lot of physical issues. So, for example, a healthcare clinic where you have physicians seeing patients, a school where you have educators that are teaching in a classroom, sort of non-traditional, like not traditional office environments, may have unique support requirements that make having someone on site, more efficient. That's something to keep in mind. User expectations, that's also a big part of it. Organizations that are used to having someone on site, that are used to walking down to the IT office and grabbing someone to come help fix their problem. There may be, that factor in determining how much on-site support is needed. But again, there's a cost associated with that. So it's part of the planning process. That's something you need to keep in mind. Operational support must provide some form of escalation. And so that's for more complex technical issues. And with the shift to cloud hosting, there's less and less of a need for that with on-premise systems. For larger, I think 100 plus staff organizations, there may be more advanced networking issues that arise, and you need to have access to a networking engineer who can solve those. But in general, a lot of systems are now out in the cloud, and so the form of escalation has become different. Cloud solutions can be as complicated or even more complicated than on-premise solutions were, and this is particularly true with Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. So those can provide a better level of service. They're not necessarily cheaper, but they get you out of having to have a server, on premise or in your closet. But in many ways, they might require just as much escalation support as an on-premise server. And then project implementation. So, that's part of operational support, just fulfilling the operational needs of the IT department, implementing the plans that were put in place. In general, it's a good idea to have, again, like some of these things are difficult to do for smaller organizations, but in general, it's good to have different staffing resources assigned to these different operational support needs. If you have the same person providing help desk support as desk side support as project implementation, then there could be conflicts and something ends up getting short shrift. And usually it's the project implementation. So if you have your help desk staff working on projects, chances are the project is going to take a lot longer just because they're going to be distracted by the ongoing support needs of the organization. So I got a question here, and the question is, what tools do I recommend for managing projects? And honestly, I would recommend, if the organization has something that they use, I would recommend using that tool. In my experience, very few IT projects of the scale of organizations with 200 staff or smaller, very few IT projects require anything more advanced than a spreadsheet. You could probably manage most IT projects with a spreadsheet. We have a ticketing system that is fairly sophisticated that we use for our help desk. Because that's our main in-house system, we also use it to manage projects. For really large projects, we use a tool called Smartsheet, which is a cloud-based sort of advanced spreadsheet solution that can be used to manage projects. That to me is sort of the upper limit of what you'd need. In general, at this scale, managing projects is sort of managing with checklists. So that's operational support. And then finally, we have infrastructure maintenance. So you may ask yourself, well, hold on a second. How is that different from operational support? It's actually very different. Operational support is all about fixing specific problems or fulfilling specific support requests that staff have related to IT services. Infrastructure maintenance is all about the general. So you're providing something that is managed at scale. It's repeatable, it's standardized. Most of the work that gets done as part of infrastructure maintenance can be automated Most of it can run in the background. It doesn't require a lot. Once you get the system in place, it doesn't require a lot of manual intervention. But having the system in place is going to save your help desk a ton of time. So, for example, a centralized antivirus solution or a centralized Windows update solution that more or less runs in the background and you're just checking logs on a regular basis to make sure it's running, that's going to save you a ton of problems down the road. So that's something that once you get the system in place, it just requires a little bit of oversight to make sure that it's still running, but it doesn't require daily work, but it saves you a lot of work in the long run. So there's a lot of software out there that sort of falls into the category of infrastructure maintenance. And it's something that these are all things that, you know, you don't want to do them manually. You want to automate them. And they help you kind of maintain the state of the platform. Even cloud hosting environments, though, require a certain level of infrastructure maintenance. And for example, Office 365, you know, you can pull regular reports from Office 365, giving you insight into how many mailboxes you have, right? How large those mailboxes are. You know, that's something that you want to kind of review on a regular basis. So it's kind of proactive, standardized, and generalized. So one last question that I had, actually I'll save this for the questions because I'm running low on time here. So just to summarize, this whole kind of concept for managing IT services can be applied to individual solutions like Microsoft Outlook. It can be applied to hosting environments like Office 365. It can and should be applied to hardware like laptops. These are all every effectively managing, you know, your hardware involves all these functional areas, but it also applies to how these things connect together. So you have a laptop, it's running Microsoft Outlook, it's accessing its email in Office 365. Is that all being well planned? Is it working in a secure way? Does a team exist to, you know, if something stops working or if you need access to something you don't have, can you get that support? You know, is the computer being updated on a regular basis? Is it safe from virus infection? Those are all questions. Those are all things that need to be done as part of effectively managing the IT solutions, both individually as well as collectively. So all of the IT solutions that an organization might use. So we are running up here on 5 o'clock East Coast time. So we're almost out of time. I do want to leave a few minutes for questions, but before I get to that, just want to say that we're going to have another webinar. Whoops, sorry, the money slide. This is kind of the summary of everything that we've talked about, and this will be in the slideshow. So we post all of our webinars, the PowerPoints we post to SlideShare, and the recording we post to our YouTube channel, and we'll send that out afterwards. So you can get this sort of one-page summary of everything that we've talked about. In summary, this really sort of summarizes the things that an IT department, person, or function needs to be doing in order to manage IT effectively. And if you're in the governance role, if you're in the role of holding IT accountable, these are the sorts of questions that you should be asking the IT department. Right. So with that, just quickly announce next month's webinar. It's going to be August 15th at 4 o'clock. And next month we will be the webinar will be presented by our information strategy partners at Build Consulting. And they're going to be, I guess, brokering a meeting between development and accounting. Development, meet accounting. They're going to be talking about the ways in which the development department, for example, records financial information for the organization in terms of like gifts, that are coming into the organization, donations, and so forth. But then that financial information, which maybe is in a development-specific information system like Razor's Edge, needs to get ported over to an accounting financial management system like QuickBooks. how does that happen? Are these departments talking to each other? How can you broker that conversation? How can you ensure that all of the different departments in the organization that are responsible for financial information are working together in concert? So please join us next month, August 15th at 4 o'clock for that webinar from Build. And I see that I'm right at 5. I have a couple questions. I'm going to get to those real quick. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And I hope you found this helpful. If you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. And if you want to stick around for some of the final questions, feel free to do so. So one question is, what's the best? So this was someone who's leaving the organization, or they're switching to part-time. What's the best way to continue handling day-to-day support of the IT if they're only going to be part-time? And kind of as I implied, if you have there's a couple ways to handle that basically, and all of them involve a conversation with the key decision makers in the organization. So if you're working 40 hours a week and you're going down to a 20-hour-a-week schedule and you are the only person available to provide IT support, then that becomes an organizational decision. Is the organization going to invest in a third-party provider to assist with providing IT support? Are they going to allow someone else in the organization to take on that responsibility? Or is it going to still be on you at 20 hours a week to continue to provide IT support? And if that's the case, then, if that's the decision that the organization makes, then the consequence is IT support is only going to be available during those hours. And I've seen organizations do every one of those. So there's no right or wrong answer. Some organizations say, you know what, for a variety of reasons, based on our financial situation, based on the IT needs of our staff, IT support will only be available from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. every day. If you have a problem after 1 o'clock, you're going to have to wait till the next morning to get it solved. That's not, for some organizations, that's a terrible decision. For some organizations, that's a great decision. So it just kind of depends. But I think, that question sort of highlights the fact that every IT decision ends up becoming a business decision in some ways, and just turning it into a business decision generally ensures that the key decision makers in the organization are understanding sort of the trade-offs that they're making. So the next question, and this is a question that there have been sessions at N10 on this. This is a question that I hear a fair amount. When to outsource? When does it make sense? Or in going back to this slide, should you outsource all of this? Which components of this should you outsource? And in general, I think the standard sort of advice from the business world on outsourcing is that it always makes sense to outsource things that are not core to your business and to keep things in-house that are core to your business. And so if specific types of technical expertise are not core to your organization achieving its mission, then it might make sense to outsource those. So for example, a small organization, they have an online database that's central to the services that they deliver and to the work that they do. They need to outsource some aspect of their IT, or they're hiring and they can only afford to hire one IT person. It really makes sense for them to hire a person who would be expert in supporting that system, because that system is core to the business needs of the organization. And then they could outsource the rest of it, because they don't necessarily need someone in-house who knows Outlook, because Outlook is sort of a generic solution that could be supported by a lot of different people. Same with infrastructure maintenance. By its very nature, that's something that is managed at scale. In fact, if you outsource that, you're probably going to be working with someone who is supporting thousands of computers and really has some great economies of scale in terms of their ability to deliver infrastructure maintenance. So again, that's going to vary, from organization to organization. If You have, if part of your core mission is, delivering laptops for use in the field or for use internationally, you could potentially make a case that that's something that should be kept in-house. It's just going to vary from organization to organization, but I think the guiding principle is that question of core business need. Is this something that really fulfills a core business need of the organization? All right. Well, I think we're at time. So thank you again to everyone who joined us today, and we will be sending out an email with the recording and slides. Thank you for your time. I hope you found this webinar helpful, and we look forward to you joining us next month. Take care.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.